Hey everybody, this is Christine Burke with Help Solve the Case. We are continuing with Chapter 13 in the Broken Plea book by retired FBI agent Christopher Whitcomb. We have been focusing very heavily on the DNA, allegedly, on the sheath that allegedly, reportedly, may or may not have tied back to Brian Kohberger. In the past two videos, if you're following this series as I read along, I've discussed my experience as a forensic genetic genealogist working these cases, what I think should have been done, shouldn't have been done, changes I would recommend, and now Whitcomb is going to talk us through, I guess, the FBI or his understanding of what he's referring to as forensic genealogy. Again, noting the forensic word there, ending up in court, okay? So he says here, though few among us, which I believe he's referring to the FBI agents, hold PhDs in forensic genealogy, the United States Department of Justice does a pretty good job of explaining Kohberger's defense. In 2011, the DOJ published its interim policy on forensic genetic genealogical DNA analysis and searching, laying out acceptable standards and methodologies in criminal investigations. He said this is the same document Ann Taylor cited at the Franks hearing, a lucid explanation of where the prosecution might have gone wrong. He said, we will not quote the entire document, but excerpts warrant citation. Now, having been a cop and having a degree in criminal justice and doing forensic genetic genealogy and training law enforcement, I have my own opinions on the FBI's document. I'm not a scientist, but I look at things from a law enforcement, legalistic, police supervision, and liability perspective. I also look at it for cost savings, successful prosecution, and a number of areas. So there are things in there that I don't agree with. I believe that the document is too restrictive unnecessarily, and so I don't agree with certain caveats in it. Okay? Excuse me. That said, Whitcomb starts to talk to us about STR DNA typing and CODIS. Now, right now, there used to only kind of be one, CODIS. Right now, there's two types of DNA investigation we can use in police cases. CODIS, the old way, which is still great, and forensic genetic genealogy, the new way. Now, CODIS uses a type of STR technology, short tandem repeat, that is not the same as SMP testing. As I mentioned in the previous video, it's like a black and white black dot matrix printer versus a color laser, a high-speed color laser. The inks don't match. It doesn't work the same way. Different type of animal. More expensive. Been around forever. Okay? He says, forensic DNA typing has historically been used to compare 13 to 20 STR DNA markers between a forensic sample and one or more reference samples. When a suspect's identity is unknown, a participating crime lab may upload a forensic profile into the FBI's CODIS system, and they're compared one-to-one match. I'm just interjecting my own here. In genetic genealogy, it is one to many matches. Remember, we talked about hundreds to thousands. CODIS, one-to-one, or one to parent, or one to child. It has to be very, 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 very close, okay? But it's one-to-one. Think about it. It's, you pull the dollar in, put the dollar in, and the name comes out, basically, if it's in there. FGG, no. You have to work the matches, all right? It's not an instantaneous hit unless your person of interest is in there. Excuse me. So he says CODIS was created by the DNA Identification Act of 1994. The FBI is created and maintaining this database. DNA files are, it searches overnight, much like APHIS searches fingerprints, and NIBIN searches bullets and shell casings and stuff, okay, like brass tracks and things. If a CODIS search results in a confirmed match between a forensic profile, that is the profile derived from the scene, and a known offender, someone that's been arrested or been convicted, and their profile is by law put in there, there's a match, okay? And that becomes a lead for the investigators to confirm. Remember, we talked about just because DNA is present doesn't mean there is not a lawful, reasonable reason that it should be there. Let's give you an example. Let's say somebody's house gets broken into and the police take DNA and they put it in the system and it gets a hit, and it gets a hit on the owner who is a convicted person, a past convicted offender. Well, just because it hit on the owner doesn't mean he's the criminal, right? So identity versus activity. So if there's no match, what are they going to do? Now, I've got some other things that I do. I call it my Y strike, but for the purposes of going through the book, what else are they going to do? Now he's talking about forensic, genetic, genealogical DNA analysis and searching, that long thing that the DOJ labeled it. He says, forensic genealogy is law enforcement's use of DNA analysis combined with traditional genealogy research to generate investigative leads for unsolved violent crimes. Forensic genetic genealogical DNA analysis, FGG, I have a registered mark on that, by the way, okay, differs from STR DNA typing in both the type and technology employed and the nature of the databases utilized. Okay, so FGG examines all these things called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, which are different than the STR markers that they look at, okay? The SNPs go through the entire genome. That's why you probably heard it called whole genome sequencing. I call it the blueprint of the person. When you do whole genome sequencing, you are outputting the whole blueprint of the person, okay? And what we get from that, because we are made up, let me use my sheet again, we are the sum total of all our ancestors. We carry little bits of DNA all the way down, and they end up residing on our chromosome. I call it like the clothesline. And we're made up of all those little bits of our ancestors, and we can trace it all the way back to our ancestors. For example, I am a Plantagenet. I am related to King Richard on my mother's side, all the way back to, what was that, 1500? Okay. So yes, you as a person carry little bits all the way down to today. It's very fascinating. Talk about ancestral Adam, ancestral Eve. I mean, it's so fascinating. That's a different video. So, Whitcomb says these SNPs span the entirety of the human genome. This allows scientists to identify shared blocks of DNA between a forensic sample, the sample pulled from the crime scene, and the sample's relatives. Okay? You put it in, you get relatives. You put the relatives together, you get the person. Okay? So he talks about how closer relatives share larger blocks of DNA. And due to predicted levels of relationship, we can, that's what I do, scientifically look at these relatives and determine relationships, figuring out who in the family tree we should look at. Okay? Excuse me. Now, Whitcomb is writing here. This is his writing. If the search of an FGG profile results in one or more genetic associations, it will. They're all relatives. But I don't think that's what he means. He says, the GG service typically generates and provides the service user with a list of genetically associated service usernames along with an estimated relationship and in some cases, the amount of DNA shared by those individuals. So yes, you can think of it like an email where you got all your emails lined up. You put the DNA in there of the offender. Let's just we're talking about offender. You put the DNA in there, they take the bioevidence, they transfer it into a computer file. The computer file, big Zippo file, goes in the computer and the matches come up like an email list. All right? Highest to lowest. Hundreds of them to thousands of them. He says the genetic association means that the donor, okay, the person whose DNA that is, our suspect in this case, he says may be related to his service user. However, information derived from a genetic association is used by law enforcement only as an investigative lead. Whatever. Those are relatives. Those are relatives. And just like I call it the computerized neighborhood canvas, just like an old dog like me, a cop dinosaur, would go around and knock on doors and say, hey, you know anybody that sounds like this or looks like this? And they would say, it sounds like my cousin Joe. Or the relatives say, yeah, it sounds like the neighbor kid down the street. Or, we had something similar happen to us. The computer does the same thing with the relatives. So instead of being on the street, hoofing it, okay, they're doing the same thing in the computer. That's what we're doing. We're talking to the relatives. And they are directing us to the person of interest. That's it. Same thing. Very easy peasy. Nothing that is not traditional police work. That's why I say it's police investigation. It's just done on the computer. It's done differently. Instead of out in the street talking to people and looking at mug books. They're getting it in the computer. They're getting what he looks like, he or she looks like in the computer. And they're getting the relatives. Okay? He says, traditional genealogical research and other investigative work is needed to determine the true nature of any genetic association. I don't know if he's reading that from the thing. He says a suspect shall not, so it sounds like it's a rule, be arrested based solely on a genetic association generated by a GG service. Now, that's those DOJ guidelines. I said they were more restrictive for my cops out there. You don't want to be under those. We're not running afoul of the system or being unethical or immoral or cheating or anything like that. It's too restrictive. We're big, bad boy and girl cops. We know how to handle private information, and we know how to do the job. Thanks, Gramps. Okay? Too restrictive, my opinion. But it says for feds and for people that have fed money, they have to follow those guidelines. And he says a suspect, right, shall not be arrested solely on an FGG service. He said if a suspect is identified after a genetic association has occurred, STR DNA typing must be performed. Yes, CODIS, yes, which was done in Brian's case. And the profile must be directly compared to the forensic profile previously uploaded to CODIS. The comparison is necessary to confirm that the forensic sample could have originated from the suspect. So we have this new method giving us a lead and giving us our person. New way. Kind of afraid of it, nervous of it, whatever. Well, okay, so we say it's this dude or dudette, and we confirm it with STR, the old way that's been going on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. But now, Gilgo Beach. STR CODIS accepted by the court for an ID. Genetic genealogy accepted for an ID. Win, win, win. Now he says, and he's reading this thing, I believe. Investigative agencies may initiate the process of considering the use of FGGS when a case involves an unsolved violent crime and the candidate forensic sample is from a putative perpetrator, suspect, or when a case involves what is reasonably believed by investigators to be the unidentified remains of a suspected homicide victim. Okay, we call that a UHR. So, unsolved violent crime, UHR, unidentified human remains. Then it goes to, because the feds operate differently, a lot of what the feds do have to get prosecutorial approval. Cops on the street typically don't do that. I made my arrest when I wanted to make my arrest. I didn't have to rely on prosecutorial approval. Feds do. Most times. And this policy says the prosecutor has to be involved. See how restrictive that is? It says, in addition, the prosecutor, as defined in the footnote 20, may authorize investigative use of FGGS for violent crimes or attempts to commit violent crimes other than homicide or sexual offenses while observing and complying with all requirements of this interim policy restrictions. When the circumstances surrounding the criminal acts present a substantial and ongoing threat to public safety or national security. So the FBI has, the DOJ has their list of when you can and when you can't, and when you need to ask mom or dad. Okay? It says, before the investigative agency may attempt to use FGGS, the profile developed from the forensic sample from the evidence must have been uploaded to CODIS and had no hit. So they're restricting you again. And that costs money. Every time you run a freaking sample, it costs us money. That's one reason I don't like this policy. Because on unidentified human remains, what I just read, you have to pay for a CODIS poll. Remember, CODIS DNA is over here. Whole genome sequencing, FGGs over here. Lab costs money. Lab costs money. But on an unidentified human remains or violent crime, they're forcing you to go over here first, which costs about $800. Then you have to come over here. Most UHR cases are way before CODIS was ever enacted. Waste of money. I get it in principle, yeah, because if the offender's already in there, hot diggity dog. But it costs money. and they're not in there due to the age of the cases. CODIS came to national prominence in 2000. Go look in the NamUs database. I have a whole video on that about how old these cases are. They're not going to be in there. We're wasting money. Okay, I don't like wasting money. Competently and cost effectively is my motto. Okay, so he says, in the interest of full disclosure, it should be noted that the author of this book worked as chief advocacy officer for a Colorado company called ANDA, developing the use of rapid DNA technology in criminal investigations. So rapid DNA is very fast CODIS. Okay, has nothing to do with this. It's very fast, instant results on CODIS, right? If you think about how the progression of technology has been in law enforcement, originally fingerprints you had to get your fingerprints inked on the paper. Then, the analyst used to have to look at it on the paper and make the manual comparison. Then it went computerized. Then the thing checks it constantly in the background, AFIS. Now you just do your fingerprints electronically, and that thing's beeping and booping all the time and giving you instant results like Google, okay? That is what rapid DNA is about. In the field, quick processing, because the CODIS database, it used to grind, okay? And it used to take a while. So now rapid DNA is fingerprint in the field, match right away, okay? That's where they're going, which is great. Which is great. We got all those people in there. He says he has lobbied, so he was a lobbyist at both state and federal levels for legislation expanding use of DNA technology. Best thing since sliced bread. DNA don't lie. He says he's worked extensively with former FBI colleagues seeking private access to CODIS. Interesting. He says, that said, the problem with using DNA for identification is what you get out is only as good as what you put in. It gets confusing. No. What you get out is only as good as who's putting it together, who's treeing it, who's planting trees. Because the profile, I'd love to talk to him about, I don't know what he's meaning there. The profile is either good or it's not. So you either get it or you don't. Okay? He says the primary issue is that scientists match genetic material using two primary methodologies. One is available to regular people who are looking to build family trees on commercially accessible sites like Ancestry.com. The other is limited to law enforcement trying to match evidence found at a crime scene to the person who left it. Let me think about that a second. They're not using two primary methodologies. The way I understand methodologies, the methodology is you spit into the tube. Let's talk Ancestor, 23andMe, whatever. You spit into the tube, or you get the buccal swab, you send it in. They output the biological material into the computer file. The computer file goes into the database. You get matches. Okay? When I get a file back from the police for a police case, it's a computer file. I put it in the database. I get matches back. If I was allowed to put DNA in Ancestry, I would take the computer file, I would put it into Ancestry, and I would get matches back. So I'm not sure that is the same methodology to me. DNA in, evaluate matches, find bad guy. Yeah? Okay. He says, okay, the other is limited to law enforcement trying to match evidence found at a crime scene to the person who left it. That kind of forensic DNA identification is the domain of the FBI via submission to its CODIS database. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that because that's what I do. The agency gets the evidence, puts it in the computer, gets a computer file, puts it in the thing, gets the matches. I look at the matches. I say, here's who it is. It's different, like we talked about, two different methodologies between STR CODIS and SMP genetic genealogy. Yes, you get the DNA, you put it in CODIS, it either matches or it doesn't. Ding, 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 or ooh. Here, you put it in, get all the relatives, and then you work the relatives like leads. He says, based on information gathered by Ann Taylor and probed at the Franks hearing, she believed police had tried to identify her client through CODIS, and when that failed, they may have violated DOJ policy by using two private databases, GEDmatch and MyHeritage. This is what was referred to as investigative genetic genealogy. Okay. I'm going to put this up there because he's not right. I mean, he's part right, but he's not right. Okay. He says, Ann Taylor believed, I'm right here, police tried to identify her client through CODIS, and when that failed, they may have violated DOJ policy by using two private databases, GEDmatch and MyHeritage. Okay, so we've heard about 10 little cells. If you've watched my other videos, you've heard about 10 little cells, which is right. And then that was developed. And I believe, I can't remember if I did it in this series or I did it specifically in the genetic genealogy series. I said, it seems like there's not enough, that they decided they may have put it in CODIS, but they weren't sure if they were going to go to YSTR or not. And there was a question around how much DNA do we have? So they went to forensic genetic genealogy. That's my understanding. So per the policy, they would have had to go to CODIS first. I'm not exactly sure because I haven't seen those reports. So he's saying they violated policy by using two private databases, GEDmatch and MyHeritage. Now, we in the industry call GEDmatch, like GEDmatch. There is a portal to GEDmatch called GEDmatch Pro that law enforcement cases use, but GEDmatch as a whole database is GEDmatch. MyHeritage is a database like Ancestry, like 23andMe, like GEDmatch. GEDmatch started out for people like me trying to find their bio family and hobby genealogists. GEDmatch, 23andMe, FTDNA. I put my DNA in FTDNA in 2013. I was in 23andMe in 2013, okay? So they're all databases. Some allow law enforcement to upload profiles to match matches. Some don't, okay? Just so we're clear on that. So he says they violated the interim policy. Now, the policy, I believe, and I don't have it in front of me and I really don't want to read it right now, I believe says that you have to use law enforcement approved databases. And if you take GEDmatch as a whole, one could consider it's on the list. MyHeritage is not. If you consider GEDmatch Pro as the GEDmatch for law enforcement and FTDNA, those are the two, then GEDmatch Plain and MyHeritage is a boo-boo, okay, against the policy. He starts talking about Rylene Nowlin. Okay, Rylene Nowlin is the manager, or she worked as the forensic manager of the Idaho State Police Forensic Services Lab. The lab that did the police lab work for the police agencies in Idaho because they don't have any, okay? Ann Taylor, during this hearing, which again, I went into in depth in that other video, is asking Rylene about forensic genetic genealogy. And she's trying to get into this thing about accredited and standards and all this stuff. And Whitcomb says, you do not need a law degree or years in law enforcement to see where this is going. Ann Taylor has staged this hearing because she has specific information regarding the prosecution's assertions that her client's DNA was found in Maddie Mogen's bed. She's trying to get that sheath dismissed however she can. So they walk through CODIS, biometric identification. She states the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab is the only DNA lab in the state, so everybody sends their stuff there. So we talked about previously when Whitcomb is hammering Payne about sending this out and sending shopping labs and all this. He didn't send it out. Idaho State Police sent it out. So they're talking about CODIS and short tandem repeats and all this. We don't need to know what SNPs are and all this stuff. And he says that after there's going to these SNPs, right, the SNP detail that's used in forensic genetic genealogy, Rylene Nowlin is like, I'm not an expert. I don't know anything about that, okay? So the prosecution objects and says something about expertise, and the judge overrules him. So Taylor's continuing asking her for these CODIS indexes and these things of all the people and the STR and all that stuff. She talks to her about using investigative genetic genealogy, and Nowlin's like, I don't know, we haven't used it. I was tasked with developing a scope of work. Basically, she's talking about the bidding process that eventually got them down to contracting with one, Othram. No shopping around. It was Othram, right? That's what I talked to you guys before. So she says, yes, they were the winning bid through the process, and so they were under contract. Then, let me put this up here. This is Whitcomb. He says, Taylor asked a number of questions about administrative matters, obligations between the state and the lab. He says, it all comes down to this. Ann Taylor knows that Othram Labs obtained the DNA profile from the K-bar sheet that was ultimately touted by the prosecution as Kohberger's. Now, I don't know if he's saying they obtained the profile that ISP developed off the sheath or Othram developed it off the sheath. Continuing. Ann Taylor knows that police had already identified her client as a suspect in the case and believed the DNA on the sheath would come back to him. That doesn't make sense to me. how would Payne get the name of somebody, of Kohberger, before the FBI calls, when Othram didn't identify the right people, apparently, according to what we've read? I don't understand where he's getting that. I would like to know where he's getting that, because I'm not interpreting that from what I've read. He continues, she, meaning Taylor, knows that as a private laboratory, Othram would not query CODIS under the rules now and previously stated, because it's only available to law enforcement. But remember, he was saying he was trying to get access to it as a private person. So maybe that's some idea. I don't know. He says, further, she knows they did not have access to a public database large enough to match the sample with Kohberger. Wrong. Sorry. The matches were in there. It is not a 1-to-1 match. No, that's what she thought. Apparently, that is not right. You can work the little matches. And I can show you. I work 15 centimorgan matches. No, I don't agree with that. But he's saying she knows that when the Idaho State Police figured it out, they took the evidence back and sent it to the FBI. So what he's saying is, when Othram threw up their hands and said, we don't have a database big enough, maybe the Q-tips came out, I don't know, because we don't have any reports or information. If there's reports information, I would love to dig into that. They were fired. They were told to stop work. It's in the pleadings. They took the evidence back, ISP, and sent it to the FBI. I'm not sure that happened, because I'm not sure that was fully uncovered in the Franks hearings. So the question is, and this is where he's going to go with this, did the FBI get a different sample? Did the FBI get a different profile? Because, and he's going to come up on this, I believe, the file that the FBI had, when you transfer files on your computer and you want to make sure you get them all in there, and so you've got the same megabytes or kilobytes on the file. Like I just transferred a huge photo folder, and you want to make sure before you delete the one that it's the same size, telling you that everything's in there. Well, apparently, from what I hear and read, the FBI's thing was huge and Othram's was little. And I still don't know. So let me walk this through. If the DNA was taken off the sheath and output, those 10 cells, whatever it was, here's the DNA. This DNA has to get computerized, and it has to get replicated and cleaned up and all this stuff that happens to it. And it has to get converted into a little zip file. Okay, and then you take that zip file and you put it into GEDmatch and FTDNA. So, if they only had 10 cells here, and I'm not the biologist, so don't ask me how much was too much and did they replicate it and amplify it and all that stuff. because we don't have any lab reports. This is the problem. We don't have any lab reports. If they used it up, remember they were talking about CODIS and all this, that they didn't think that they had enough. They were worried about not having enough because you're supposed to leave some for the defense, FYI. If they used it all up when it went to Othram, what did the FBI have to work with? What did they get? What did they get? Do we have a chain of custody showing this file going from Othram to the FBI? And if it did go that way, why is it humongous and bigger? Shouldn't be bigger. Do we have the information of this file and all the stuff going to Othram? How they output the sample, all the people that touched it, Do we have that? I don't think we have that. We only got a preliminary report according to Brett Payne's testimony. So, if they used it up and Othram did not give their file to the FBI, what was the FBI working on? Whose DNA? Where did they get the DNA? I haven't seen it. So Ann Taylor is still talking to Nowlin. Were you aware that Othram was stopped from doing any further work at some point? I was aware of that. And this was before they produced any results. She says, no, we received a preliminary report. I recall receiving that because that's how I can approve payment of the invoice. So I know we received that prior to them being told they were stopped. Well, to me, a result is if I say I'm going to give you a person, I'm going to give you a person. If I tell you I'm going to bake you a cake for $10, I'm not going to ask for my $10 until I hand you the cake. I'm not going to roll the crust out. Well, we don't have crust in cake. I'm not going to mix the ingredients and pour it in the pan and give you the wet batter and ask you for the invoice. Right? To me, that's not a result. A preliminary result, a Q-tip result, like, I don't know, but to me, that's not a result. That's, so what Whitcomb is saying here is Taylor is establishing that the ISP lab, Idaho State Police, sent the K-bar sheath DNA to Othram. So he's saying there, he's acknowledging that ISP extracted it off the sheath and output it. Where am I? And then sent it to Othram. Othram produced a preliminary report and work stopped. And he says it was discontinued only in this particular case. No. Talk to me, babe. Okay? Talk to me. It happens a lot. Okay? She asked, does the forensics lab continue to contract with Othram? Yes. He continues. Laying further foundation, Taylor asked Nowlin if she was made aware of a trash pull. I talked about trash in an earlier video. He says the one we now know occurred December 27, 2022 at the Kohberger home in Pennsylvania. They would have needed that for the confirmation, for the affidavit, for the arrest warrant. So it has to be December 30th. Date deal again. Nowlin, this ISP manager, states that she was aware of the warrantless search for the trash, and she recalled being asked by detectives which items might be most likely to yield usable samples. She says the discussion was that a person of interest had been developed and to analyze items from the trash to determine if they could be inclusive of the DNA profile that was developed from the knife sheath, unknown male A. Nowlin explains. Unknown male A, because we have some other unknown males, was Brian Kohberger. Everyone in the case knew it at that point. They had him and his family under surveillance. That's what Whitcomb's saying. She's asked, what date was it you received the trash? And she said it was received December 28th of 2022. They're going back and forth about the trash. He says that the lab manager seemed to dodge it. Going back and forth about you knew you were looking for a male and you knew that the male and his family members lived in a house that produced the bag of trash. Is that right? Yeah. So I told you I pulled like a lot of trash. Okay. Well, yeah, you're going to look at what would be an item that they would touch more than others. Oh my God, there's a baseball in there. I don't know. I'm trying to think. There's a cigar in there. Well, who's more likely, no offense to the women that smoke, but I mean, who's more likely to be smoking the cigar? A male. Just common, whatever. Okay. Anyway, let me put this up. Okay. So Whitcomb here is writing, the implication at this point is clear. According to Detective Payne's testimony, police had identified Brian Kohberger as a suspect from an FBI cast member. Now, I don't know where the genetic genealogy comes from. It comes from this cast group. I don't know. They said that was a cellular technology thing. He's a Fed. He was a Fed. He knows better. I don't know. He says they, meaning the cops, used that information to narrow their search of white sedans to a 2011-2013 Hyundai Elantra, then to his 2015 model. According to Payne, says Whitcomb, Kohberger must have been under investigation by December 19th because CAST was tracking his phone. Now, I have not seen that anywhere. Is that true? I will get there. He says, so this is another revelation. Because I talked about when I was looking at the FGG and Payne was under oath and he said, I didn't know anything about him until the night of December 19th when they whispered, Brian Kohberger. He didn't know anything. So, I don't know, maybe because the FBI, their genetic genealogist or whatever, they were hinting around at the Kohberger family. And one FBI whispered to the other FBI agent in the cellular area. And they started looking at phones and they said, oh my God, we've got one in Washington, 10 miles away. And maybe they shared that information before Payne knew about it. Could happen. That they wanted to be certain or more certain than before they told Payne. Could happen. I don't know. I haven't seen the cast detail or the cast reports. Okay. He says, it seems impossible that the detective in charge did not know Kohberger's name until then. Something was not adding up. Well, no, the feds are doing their Fed thing. They're talking to their Fed buddies. They're not talking to the lokes. Happens all the time. Happens all the time. So is it a big deal? No. 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 Then he says, which brings us to Ann Taylor's third witness at the January 23rd hearing. His name was Matthew Gumet, Idaho State Police Forensics. Contracts. Because this is like, all right, so he says that their early communication with Othram was giving them DNA. Okay, so ISP pulled it, gave it to Othram that they could get an investigative lead. He says after that sample had been, he says, we followed our process through that. We had put a sample into CODIS and we were not received any hits. Okay, so that makes it okay. I was going to say legal, but okay, under the DOJ guidelines, we would proceed with the next step of testing. We did have a contractual relationship with them since early in 2021. So we did have a contract with them in place. Okay, this is Taylor asking, how did they get the DNA? They flew down there. They actually flew down there. He went down there. This guy, Gumet, went down there. And Othram was given the DNA on November 22nd. And they were notified to stop work on December 10th. So, he's asking about Othram's recommendation on what to do, right? What in this preliminary, right, that they started work on November 22nd, and they, in their update to ISP or whatever it was, their recommendation was that they had several individuals that had the potential to be of interest. They ask us, this is ISP, and I told you about the Q-tips. They ask us if, to further their family tree building, if we could be in contact with individuals and see if they were willing to contribute information into the database that they were using in order to further the family tree building and further the genealogical work. It's a spelling error. No. You build off the matches. You build off the matches. That's it. You investigate leads, relatives that are in the database. Whitcomb says, for the record, Gumet is telling Taylor that the Othram lab had identified several individuals based on DNA analysis of the K-bar sheath found in Mogen's room. That is not, well, I can't say that's not correct. I believe he's mistaken about the process. And I'll tell you why. Hold on, I'm trying to get my snips here. Sorry, folks. I could be wrong, but I believe he's mistaken just because of the way the process works. Okay. I don't agree with this, but I haven't seen any paperwork. So, going back to this, let me build a couple more here just to show you. All right. Oh, sorry, I thought I paused it. Sorry, guys. Okay, and hopefully you can see this. Let's pretend this is a family tree, right? And I don't have another color here. Let's pretend this is Brian or any suspect. It's me. We're going to have cousins and matches and different things that are over here, especially when the DNA is in smaller quantity, when we have lower matches, which is very common in the police databases because of all this privacy crap that they promote. Okay? So, when you have people over here, you're trying to get up to here because you have to come down to here. Sometimes people don't know their people in here. So when you're looking up here, for instance, if this is Burke, we'll say it's me, this Burke, you're not going to see Burks over here because they're not Burks. Because these people up here, especially the women, get married and their names change. So as it flows down, your names change. So if you don't build a big enough tree and work all those smaller matches up, and over and expand a jungle, you got to go up to come down. And so with those initial matches or brothers or whatever it was, they could have been in the right tree. They just did not plant enough seeds in the forest to grow the trees and the branches to get over to, in this case, we're talking about me or Brian. Like I said before, they could have been right. Those people in the database, if it was Brian's DNA, are Brian's relatives. So it has to match. It has to. And here's the problem with most forensic genetic genealogists and investigations. They don't recognize when they have a problem. They don't recognize when they are barking up the wrong tree. Okay? I'm especially good at it because my family is so messed up. I've seen every problem known to man, pretty much. I know what half siblings look like, adopted people look like, hidden people, you name it. So when you study the matches, you will know when somebody doesn't know who they are. And when they don't know who they are, their tree is not going to look right. It doesn't mean you have the wrong people. You have to recognize, kind of like when you're talking to a suspect and they're BSing you and telling you that there's some other name, and you're running a warrants check and they're clear, but you know the guy's sweating. You got to figure out what his name is or what is going on, what is wrong. Okay, because you're sensing it. He's sweating. He's, got the heebie-jeebies, and he's like, I'm fine, officer. Nope, nothing. Okay, you have to dig. You have to know. So when he says that they had identified several individuals, they're all relatives. So yes, they're related. If the DNA on the sheath was the one put in there and it was Brian's DNA, then yes, those people are related and identified based on the DNA analysis. They just were over here. They were not over here yet. And until I see a tree or some document or the preliminary report, it doesn't mean that they identified the wrong people. They just weren't fast enough. And they were using Q-tip. Go get the Q-tips instead of building the forest. Okay? It can only be one of two things because those are the relatives. So either, and I don't know if this was challenged because we had no chain of custody on the DNA that went from ISP to Othram. Like ISP went down there and handed it to him. And this is the question I asked my cops. What chain of custody happens at the private lab? Where is the police SOP and operating procedure about policies and procedures and all that stuff? All the stuff that you can read the book and you can go to the pleading and you can look at my other thing about what Riley Nowlin said about SOP and operating procedures and accreditation and rules and standards and all this stuff. We don't have those. That seems to be a Brady to me. So we can't tell. I'm going to scare you here. I scare myself. We can't tell that what Othram had was Brian. What if it was another profile? Now, we've heard it's a single source profile. If the FBI got the same computer file that Othram had, because they wouldn't have needed to redevelop the DNA, they should have come up with the same person. They should have those brothers in their tree. If the FBI took the sheet and pulled different DNA off of it, if there was a mixture, if it wasn't single source, whatever, they could have a different family. They could have a different forest. Scary, right? And we've seen none of that. So all these areas, in my opinion, I'm not an attorney, are challengeable. And he pled. Okay? So we don't know. I haven't seen. Does anybody have that preliminary report? Put it in the comments below. Where are these reports? Where are these family trees? Okay? And then they declined to use it in the affidavit. Why? Because they went into the other databases with permission or whatever it was said. But that's how this stuff works. Like, this is not... We don't know. And the fact that we don't know, that seems to be an exculpatory issue to me. I'm not a lawyer. Okay. Let me just finish this up here, this part. No, I'm going to leave it here and we're going to go on to the next one. Comments below. Sorry. Ticks me off.